Welcome to the latest episode of FoodTech Stories. I'm your host, FoodTech marketing expert Megan Thomas. FoodTech Stories features the leaders pioneering new approaches to technology, collaboration, and storytelling in the food tech and ag tech space. Food and agriculture changing, and fresh ideas and leadership are needed to sustainably feed the growing global population. Join us every other week as we talk to a founder, operator, or visionary in food and agriculture. This episode, we're going to take a food engineer's view on getting to product market fit. Today, my guest is Matt Tom, and Matt is founder of MTCC, where he consults on product development and go-to-market strategy for startups based in North America, Asia, and Europe.
Hi, Megan. Great to be on here. Thank you so much.
I'm really curious how you got your start. What led you to become involved in developing products for food tech companies?
I actually kind of fell into it accidentally. I started out in biomedical devices. I went to school for. I was at the time and still am fascinated by what I considered the human body to be like the ultimate machine. And as an engineer, of course, I'm like, ooh, I get to tinker with stuff. Cool. Biomedical devices was awesome. I think one of the things that we all engineers love to do is, oh, if you get to play with bigger machines, then go for it. And so I was working primarily on, stents and catheters and intravenous cameras and all sorts of interesting technology. And the equipment and analytical machines I was using were really cool. When I got the chance to jump on some bigger ones, I took that interview, I got through it. And then at the end, I was kind of like, well, you don't do medical things. What do you do with this stuff? And they said, oh, we make food on it. Horizons expanded, and I was putting like metal and rubber into stuff, and you can put food material in there. That's so cool. I made that realization. It was kind of like you have a unit op, you have some functions, but you change the inputs, you get different outputs. What sealed it for me was, oh, plus you get to eat all of your experiments. All right, cool. Sign me up. So that's how I got into it. Serendipitously, the initial projects I was on were plant-based. Basically, what I was trying to do, they were like, just make snack foods a little bit healthier. Try to add some protein content, try to add some fiber, this, that, and the other. And so I had right from the start been exposed to thinking of things in like an engineer would, right? Like put stuff together, see what you get. The whole system is interacting with each other. I kind of made a name for myself. And then sometime around 2010, this Stanford professor started making waves because he was like, I'm going to make beef out of plants. I was still stupidly thinking like, hey, you can't make stuff out of other stuff, even though I had just learned you could put food on machines I was not putting food, right? I was like pinging him because I was like, I got to talk to you. Like, how can you do this? This doesn't make any sense. You can't make stuff out of other stuff. Eventually, I was convinced. It was like, hey, let's give it a try, right? It's just biology building blocks, right? So that's how I fell into it. It's been so exciting that I've stuck with it because of all the cool things we can create.
Did you find your skills in, say, working with rubber, other materials, translatable over to food, or were there fundamental differences?
I'm mostly a process engineer. I'm focused more on that particular unit operation, and the inputs and outputs just become like details of materials. It was a little bit easier for me to cope with that than if I had been mired in a certain thinking.
I'm not an engineer, but what you said made sense to me. So, Matt, I know you've worked in a variety of food tech categories, from plant-based dairy to plant-based meat, as you mentioned, snacks, even beverages. In what ways were the opportunities and challenges of those industries or the startups in those industries similar?
What is required among them was sort of a good scientific engineering sort of base foundation, right? Just understanding of how things work. I'm not the detailed expert in biology by any means or other sciences, but if you sort of understand how things work and how they should logically progress, you have a good foundation to build on. And that really helps in the technical side of things. But I think what I found most interesting and similar among these is that the place that we're motivated to come from, if you put at the top of that thing, like, I want to do things efficiently, I want to do things sustainably, I want to do things where we take into account health and nutrition and wellness and wholesomeness, it kind of frames very broadly what you can do. I feel like those are the things that I found to be so much more interesting when I was talking to people, because like I said, many of these regimes are new to me. They had those kind of motivational factors and mission and values embedded. It translated into the thinking and indeed the development, the innovation.
And were those different categories or those producers, are they different in any fundamental ways?
Product categories are kind of like beverage is very different than a bar, than a cookie, than a whatever. Each of them have their own uniqueness. And that's a part of where my consulting company steps into play because I've seen all of these different categories and I can tell them like, if you think you're going to mix it this way, it's not going to work mixing it that same way in this other thing. If you look at it more from a materials perspective, it becomes a lot easier to understand when people are like, oh, you can't do that. And you're like, but maybe.
Yeah, you need a new SOP. During your tenure in the space, how long have you worked in food tech?
I started out doing plant-based things, I want to say, in the early 2000s, but I really jumped into the startup scene in about 2010. Prior to that, I had been working for the US Department of Agriculture. We do the same sort of cutting edge research. The only difference, I feel like, it's mired in bureaucracy. So like all of this cool stuff comes out, right? And it's like, well, just go read our journal article. And I'm like, but how do we get it into people's hands?
That's the output is the paper, right? The article, not the product. I've heard that from a lot of scientists who've made a shift over to industry. So you've been in the space for quite some time. What has changed during that time? Are there one or two things that you think of really different than they were, say, in the early 2000s or even 2010?
A part of it that stays constant is the sort of optimism and innovation. But I think what has changed is the realization that science is difficult, right? You have to figure out how things work and then be able to predict it, right? Because when you go to manufacturing, what you want to be able to do is produce high quality safety consistently, right? Otherwise, it's not a product that you can sell at large scale. It becomes sort of like craft or artisanal. Not that those are bad things, but the impact that we're trying to have on the food system pushes you along a certain direction. That's kind of been the realization over time that we really need to figure out how things work so that we can make it more repeatable. The other big thing is really jumping into looking for solutions in the now. There's a part of it where, yes, you want that anticipation, like look at this new thing I'm going to create and it's coming. So there's something where there is a benefit to saying this is where that technology can ultimately end up. But what people are looking for are the things to solve the issues that they have today. And what we've noticed in the food space, I think, is a move towards, like I said, being healthier, being less processed, being wholesome, being convenient, especially on our on-the-go lifestyles. My kind of critique on the industry is that we've thought about them as other generic products, but food is so different, right? It's very emotional, it's very social, it's really an experience rather than a product, right? And so you have to kind of be able to deliver on all of those aspects. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Now that we've matured along the pathway, I think today's things are looking more at consumer perception, consumer behavior. There are some things you can't trade off, taste and cost and other things, right? But you do have to bundle the whole experience. It can't just be another gadget.
Yeah, it's got to deliver different benefits, emotional benefits as well. Do you work on sensory as part of the work that you do, or do you work hand in hand with someone who's focused on the sensory characteristics of a product?
On my team, I do have sensory experts, and we kind of drive at it in a couple of different ways, trying to understand directionally where people are responding to the prototypes that are being created. The second one is trying to dig in and understanding what are some of the direct changes that we can make, either to the process or to the formula, to kind of highlight some of the features that we think are having a big impact. And then, of course, trying to make sure that it's representative. A lot of folks, at least in the very early stages, you kind of talk to your coworkers and they become all your sensory testers. We're all in this bubble because we're thinking the same way. That's why we're working on the same thing. And you really need to get outside of that.
When you're starting off with the new partner, new startup, are you overseeing all of product development, or are you working hand in hand with a core team of their team? And if so, what roles do they have?
I get to jump in at two spots. I'm most known for work that comes later downstream. That's the transition off the bench top into manufacturing scenarios. And that's when people are like, oh yeah, Matt, the engineer guy, he's the one that called there. But over time, I had recognized that if you don't design correctly upfront in the beginning, then transitioning into manufacturing is really difficult. I found myself moving further and further upstream, trying to contact folks earlier to say, hey, look, we got to design this so that you can manufacture it. The two places we come in is, yeah, at the very beginning when we're trying to help strategize how they're going to go about their product development, and then support there anywhere along that chain as long as it's more on the food side. I do tend to work with a lot of deep science, deep tech companies because that's so interesting. Where we really have expertise is when it becomes closer to being the food item. And then the second place, of course, is like I mentioned at that commercialization scale-up stage, a process that can be something manufacturing can take care of.
I think that makes a tremendous amount of sense to be moving upstream. And I can certainly think of many scenarios in my career where we wish we'd started certain things earlier, right? Or had certain insights or taken into consideration certain factors earlier. So that's very intuitive. Have you had a project where you had some really surprising outcomes?
The cool thing about being in the position that I am and seeing not only the products across the whole value chain in that development cycle, but also coming from other industries. I like to tell people like, oh, you don't have to reinvent the wheel if we figured this out somewhere else. We just kind of have to tweak it a little bit. That is kind of one of the things that I think is going to be so interesting about these blended products and hybrid products gaining traction, because now we can bring in some of the know-how that already exists and see if we can make something that works synergistically, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really innovative approach and an approach I don't hear used that often. So I think you're definitely onto something. Is there a technology in the food tech space that you're really excited about that's just coming into play?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting things. Plant molecular farming is certainly super interesting to me as we kind of think about this more in the global sense. I've had opportunity to work in different parts of the world. Being in Silicon Valley or in the US in general, you kind of forget just how expensive stuff is. When you're in the lab, I remember when people are like, oh, just get on Amazon and order it, or get on VWR and order it. When you're working in different parts of the world, that doesn't really exist. And so you kind of have to rethink about how you're going to do it and how you're going to implement it. Some of the technologies are kind of made in that way. I like to look at Engineer Without Borders as kind of a model for that, right? Where they're really ingenious kind of things that you can do that actually solve the problem you're looking at, but it's on the cheap. And not to say that plant molecular farming is on the cheap, right? There's obviously a lot of very deep science on the biology side of that, but it's a concept to me that says, hey, look, plants grow. If we can leverage our ability to do that because we know how to optimize a growing season or session. Biomass fermentation, I think, is also very, very interesting. Other sort of more interesting technologies, 3D printing, fiber spinning, just because of the coolness factor.
Tell me about fiber spinning.
The original idea of that was like, hey, if you look at animal muscle, they come in bundles. We know from the textile industry how to spin fibers. Maybe there's a way to do that with materials so that you end up with a food product. It's an interesting idea. There's a variety of startups as well as research in the universities that had been working on something like this. I remember back in the 2000s, it wasn't really fiber spinning. It wasn't really being a spun fiber, but it was aligning all of the protein strands in a certain way so that you could think of it like a bundle. And now today, there are certain ones like electrospinning or blow spinning and things like that. Their whole purpose is to create fibers like you would imagine the textile world does, and then bundle all those fibers together. Now, whether or not that's going to make a meat product that, is interesting or cost effective or what have you, I don't know, right? I'm just like, oh, that's a cool technology. It seems analogous. Let's see what happens to it.
Yeah, exactly. It's not dissimilar to what you've been talking about. It's used in this one application, and can we bring it to food? Kind of leveraging the latest technology to do so. One of the topics of this podcast is talking about product market fit. Startups are very focused on getting to product market fit, and they take different paths to get there. As a food engineer, how do you think about getting to product market fit, potentially leveraging an example or two from your past?
I kind of think of it in four big buckets, and I don't know how much engineering there's going to be. Those four buckets is the customer, the problem that's being solved, what the actual product is, and then the business model. Necessarily learning those things in a startup happens in different phases. With a lot of the science-based ones, they sort of immediately jump into that third bucket, the product. And you're kind of like, wait, what about these other ones? At least the way I've been taught, and I use the Six Sigma framework for a lot of this, the very first step they tell you is find out who your customer is, and then you kind of have to get your requirements from them. And that's that stage called voice of the customer, and you kind of understand what are their actual needs. Only then can you be like, oh, now I have an idea of how to design a product for that. Those first two buckets are really, really important. It's hard to convince people that when they're very interested in science, like I'm in the middle of making a great discovery, until you go back and say, well, what does your customer want? And what is the problem that they're having that they want solved? So I think those are the two immediate things that really need bulking up on. And it's okay to start with that product, but realize that you're going to be adding things and removing things in order to make sure that it aligns with those first two buckets. And so let me focus a a little bit on the customer. I think in most of alt protein, the companies there, the customer they're targeting, that definition is very, very broad. Anybody who eats food, anybody who eats meat.
People who want more protein in their diet. Yeah.
You have to drive really, really down because you're selling a product. So you need that thing that speaks to them. So you need to be very, very specific. Once you found that customer, you need to understand what is that main problem or issue that they want solved right away. It might be completely unsexy. Some things we have like our Google Assistant. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the most bells and whistles type thing, but it could be. So you need to really find out what is that main problem. And then you can build your product to meet that thing. Once you have that prototype, the next part is you've moved past the phase of the startup where you're just figuring out how to build it. Okay, now this needs to be a business. The business model comes into play here. And I think this is something that folks also kind of miss is that your product will change or your business model will change based on the interaction between those two. It has changed over time too, especially through COVID. Back in the olden days, it was like, let me get into a grocery store. Nowadays, it's kind of like, did they hear about it on Instagram? And is there a Shopify front? So you have to understand who you're reaching, how you're going to connect to them, and then how you're going to do that sales and distribution. There's all the costs that are different. And that will change your product, at least in this beginning phase, for you to continue to optimize and iterate until you get to probably that end goal. In the very early stages here where you're trying to test it and get that product market fit, it's really a combination of those four things.
Having worked myself in very large food companies, I've worked in mid-sized companies, I've worked in startups. When you're working with an established business and brand, innovation looks very different than when you're in a startup. You don't have the history. You don't have channel or go-to-market expertise within the team. In my experience, it's much harder to even define what your MVP is because you're going to be learning all the time. But it's that constant kind of push-pull of figuring out, well, what can we achieve? Can we make money doing it? Does it meet that customer need? That was really well articulated. What can larger ingredient and CPG players learn from innovation and the type of innovation you've been doing in the startup ecosystem?
There's a time and place to have processes. When I put on the operations hat and do that thing, then I'm like, oh my God, you don't have a process. On the innovation side, that does slow it down somewhat. And so I'm not saying to get rid of it completely, but there needs to be a way to make it work. I remember on some innovation calls where I'm with these large corporates and it's kind of like, okay, so it takes 2 weeks to schedule the conference call that everybody can make. 2 weeks time in startup world, the world can change. That's probably the number one. The number two one, I think knowledge tends to get siloed. I don't think that it's intentional, but combined with the bureaucracy there, then it's really hard to get at the knowledge that you need and make sure that everybody's involved knows what they need to know in order to do the things they need to do. That's sort of been things we help build cross-functional teams or we help with communication because as you know, all the different business units, they have different vocabulary, different personalities. And so it's not just access to that knowledge, it's making sure that people can understand the knowledge that's there. The third one, the diversity, right? The DEI stuff. You need all of these different perspectives and inputs to help you see your blind spots. That's one of the biggest things here. Programs get implemented and maybe they're not implemented in the perfect ways. The fundamental thing of making sure that you have a diverse perspective will allow you to see the blind spots so that you can make sure that the thing that you're working on makes sense.
Your point on a diversity of perspectives is appropriate for startups, mid-sized companies, large companies, really in any situation, right? Is ensuring it's really part of challenging your hypotheses, doing the best work possible. I love that you brought that point forward. So looking to the future, Matt, what are you most excited about?
Yeah, we're all looking for things to change and what's going to be exciting about that. And I've kind of been fascinated by two aspects. The first one is earlier in the year, I think it was in January, there was a push from the government to start looking at food as medicine. And in part, it was sort of like in response to, our healthcare situation. And the other part of it was with the onset of these GLP-1 drugs, right? Like it's going to change people's behaviors and preferences and things like that. And I've always kind of considered food to be a big part of making you healthy and well, right? And nutrition and all of those things. So I'm very excited about food as medicine. And then I think the other part is collaboration and understanding that we have to build an ecosystem. And so there are investments and opportunities all along the value chain. There's more of a focus at looking about where folks can solve specific issues instead of getting that one vertically integrated startup from the crop to the end product. And I think like that's going to be very, very useful when we solve very specific problems along the value chain. There's adjacency. And so all of that stuff is going to push into other areas where they can all see this improvement.
I've enjoyed our conversation. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Realize that this is something worth doing and is still happening. And I encourage a lot of people that are interested to come over and work in the space. Because I'm in Silicon Valley, the news is always about AI this, AI that. And obviously, I think that's important too and very interesting. Back in the early days of my career when they're like, oh, you can eat your own experiments and food can run on these machines too. That's what made it so exciting, this accidental pivot into this career.
I love the idea of the accidental pivot. And if folks wanted to get more information about the field, do you have any specific organizations or resources you would highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. I think GFI is the big one.
Good Food Institute.
Yeah, a variety of food hack groups, hack summit groups, food and climate groups. If you are interested in climate or energy or materials or transportation or ag or food, they all kind of touch each other. It's worth exploring if you've ever had curiosity about it, just to see what's in it. I got into it from the science and technology portion, right? And then being embedded in it, then I recognized the impact, the mission and the values also become a core part of it. It's one of those things where you can approach it from any angle, any perspective, and then find some facet that's going to be very interesting and fulfilling for you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for joining us today on the latest episode of Food Tech Stories. Be sure and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and keep an eye out for our bi-weekly episodes. I'm your host, Megan Thomas, founder of Ladder 17. Food Tech Stories is edited by TJG Media.